Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Michelle Fitzgerald, and I'm the Curator of Collections at Johns Hopkins University Museums. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce you to an upcoming exhibition opening this September at Evergreen Museum and Library, one of the two historic houses at Johns Hopkins University. This upcoming exhibit, called Leave No Trace, will focus on the material world of outdoor recreation through the lens of one young man's trips to Yellowstone National Park in 1894 and 1895. But first, let's actually start our story inside. I want you to briefly imagine a crowded dining hall at Princeton University. A young man dressed in a suit stands up in the crowd of his peers and taps his glass. He begins a speech that has his fellow students in the hall, all just hours away from graduating from this university, laughing and reminiscing. At one point, the speaker points out a young man with slicked back hair and jokes, quote, "John is one of a batch of geologists who went west to hunt up specimens. They all came back and reported having a most successful trip. They found that the whiskey was of a very poor quality, and the beer, although good, was terribly high-priced. John had a little bit of a white horse he used to ride when out on his researches, and thereby hangs a tale." It was an impressive sight to see John astride the diminutive beast who stood in his stocking feet just 13 hands high. John's feet trailed along the ground on either side, so when the pony would lag from exhaustion, John would help it along by pushing. Well, somehow the pony always lagged, and consequently, John had to do a great deal of pushing. It was after a particularly hot and long hunt one day that John found that the specimen he was after, and after tying his horse to a telegraph pole in front of the building, went in to get cooled off. John was much pleased with his discovery. How long he stayed in there, I couldn't discover. But when he came out, a most pathetic picture was revealed. There stood the little white horse, leaning against the telegraph pole, asleep. The subject of this particular anecdote is John Work Garrett, who would go on after his Princeton years to be remembered as a diplomat and renowned book collector. However, in this story, told by a fellow Princeton student, Garrett is just a young man, revisiting a pivotal experience in his life as part of one of Princeton University's geologic expeditions that ran in the late 19th century. For John, his time on those trips out west with his Princeton colleagues was the beginning of a lifelong interest in the American outdoors. Garrett collected and decorated spaces of his Baltimore home, Evergreen, with materials connected to the outdoors ranging from taxidermy to rocks and an impressive collection of books pertaining to the rising interests among Americans in the outdoors. His selection and display of objects in his residence, in turn, influenced the opinions of East Coast and European visitors to Evergreen, who may not have ever seen the new parklands out west, but would soon begin to formulate an opinion on it from the material evidence they have through Garrett's curation. By no means was Garrett the only East Coaster with a passion for the types of recreation that can be found in the American outdoors. Rather, he was among a generation of individuals who began to pivot from the 18th century mindset of the natural world as dangerous into nature with its lakes, mountains, and woodlands as places of retreat. Increased urbanization brought about by the Industrial Revolution left Americans seeking escape from cramped city environments in exchange for space and fresh air. Places like the Adirondacks, Niagara Falls, and the Western Plains began to experience an influx of tourism that would only increase over the years. Perhaps you've logged on to this lecture because you have a personal interest in hiking, climbing, bird watching, or any other activity that allows you to spend some time in the outdoors. Or maybe you're more of an armchair traveler. In either case, the story about John Work Garrett and his horse may have resonated with you, and there's a reason for that. As we look at the history of outdoor recreation in the United States, we can see that the adventures of past Americans are closely tied to our present-day experience. Sometimes this is more obvious, like laws set up in response to historic habits that had destructive consequences. Other times, it can be less apparent, like starting trends of capturing specific viewpoints on camera, or the types of food we connect with camping. In the next hour, we'll touch on many of those patterns, looking at just one man, John Work Garrett, and his experiences in the outdoors, examining how his travels captured outdoor tourism trends that continue to impact our perceptions of the outdoors today. While Garrett visited parklands in the United States at many different points in life, He depicted his participation in the 1894 and 1895 Princeton Geological Expeditions as some of the most significant outdoor experiences in his lifetime. Because of the wealth of surviving material regarding these two trips and Garrett's personal investment in them, they'll serve as our case study for the world of outdoor recreational material culture. Garrett left behind two critical forms of documentation during these two trips: a journal kept almost daily, which document his day-to-day life while on the expedition, and a series of photographs capturing firsthand views of the expedition experience. Both records are remarkable. Together, they create an in-depth understanding of the early national parkland experience through the eyes of one of the earliest tourists. The Princeton Geological Expeditions were field studies in which Princeton students would journey out west for several weeks during the summer, looking primarily for fossils and natural specimens of geologic interest. The trips were intended to mimic scientific expeditions funded by the United States government just a few decades before when surveying the American West. During the years that Garrett was on the crew for the expedition, it was led by John Bell Hatcher, known by some of his contemporaries as the king of collectors. During his career as a paleontologist, Hatcher was credited with the discovery of significant dinosaur genera, like the Triceratops, as well as developing careful excavation methods, which led to less damage in excavated fossils. Altogether, the team comprised of Hatcher, 12 students, a cook, 2 guides named Edmonds and Taffin, and a coach driver. The students' findings would then be delivered to Princeton's Geological Museum for display. In one year that Garrett participated in, the students were credited with the excavation of a fully intact entelodonte, popularly known today as a hell pig. They ultimately delivered 9,000 pounds of specimens in 32 boxes back to Princeton. The feat of these excavations is fairly remarkable when you think about the ages of some of these students, most of whom would have been 21 or 22 years old, and from affluent East Coast families. In fact, there appeared to be a distinct level of anxiety surrounding the well-being of these students in particular, as their expeditions were well recorded in newspapers. There was even one case in 1895 when the students failed to telegram home in a timely manner, prompting an outbreak of a false story in national newspapers that they had been captured by a group of Northern Shoshone. However, the suspected Shoshone said that they had never even seen the students. To the immense relief and surprise of their mothers, the students telegrammed them that they were okay the next time they were in town and had been held up by a delayed train. They were quite surprised to learn about the news outbreak pertaining to them. While any student going on the Princeton Geological Expedition was required to have skills in both riding and the handling of rifles, they were ultimately reliant on the assistance of guides. At the time of the expeditions, the American West, and particularly national parklands, did not have well-established roads or campsites. Park guides would manage the route of a trip and direct the wagon outfits that would carry the students' luggage from campsite to campsite. While the bulk of the Princeton Geological Expeditions took place around Colorado, the Yellowstone Valley was the focus during the 2 years that Garrett attended in 1894 and 1895. At the time of Garrett's first trip, only 3,105 visitors were recorded as visiting the 22-year-old park. Compare that for a second with the 3.29 million people who visited Yellowstone annually today. Garrett's travels on the expeditions offered him some of the first glimpses as a European-American tourist of Yellowstone. His initial impressions no doubt impacted the imaginations of East Coasters at home who had not visited the park. From the photographs and Garrett's diary entries, we know the students found a lot of joy in the outdoor recreational part of their experiences. Garrett frequently chose to sleep under the stars rather than in his tent and relished the opportunity to hunt and fish whenever he could. The travel allowed the students a certain kind of freedom that one can find in nature, and Garrett wrote of moments such as, quote, "I galloped on abroad over a broad plateau, enjoying myself immensely," end quote. However, just as significantly to us as historians, Garrett also recorded plenty of stories where the students were not enjoying themselves quite as much, offering a glimpse into some of the difficulties of camp life in the late 19th century. The very next day, after writing of his gallop across a field, Garrett wrote, quote, "This riding along all day in the rain isn't what it might be cracked up to be," end quote. a relatable sentiment to anyone stuck on a trail ride with a wet and cranky horse. Meals at camp were repetitive and usually made of dried provisions depending on what was in stock. At one point, Garrett complained, quote, "Have had nothing but potatoes and bacon to eat for 4 meals," end quote. The students definitely had a sweet tooth as well, frequently getting ice cream in town or recounting the menu of some of their favorite meals that may not look all that different from a modern-day college student's diet. One particular feast acquired by the students in town included, quote, "hot applesauce, cake, donuts, milk, and especially delicious cream," end quote. Food supplies would have been carried on a wagon, pulled by a team of horses, and driven by one of the hired teamsters. The sheer weight of outdoor equipment at the time meant that the students were reliant on the wagon outfit getting from campsite to campsite with them. However, because Yellowstone had not yet established easy roads for wagons, Garrett and his peers were frequently finding detour routes for the wagon outfit around steep hills or rocky terrain, or were physically pushing the wagon across troublesome creeks. Stories and photographs like Garrett's capture far more than just the experiences of the students, however. We also see what life was like for the people who lived year-round on the same land traversed by Garrett, including laborers, town residents, and Native people living on one of the 3 reservations the expedition spent time in between 1894 and 1895. During his trips to Yellowstone, Garrett recorded interactions he had with individuals who are remembered by history, like Shoshone leaders and U.S. cavalry officers, as well as those who may have been forgotten, like Mr. Ruffy, an old coach driver from Deadwood who accompanied the students on their travels, or of Reverend and Mrs. Mooney, who complained to Garrett about the state of their town before giving him lodging for the night. When compiled together, we see glimpses of a West that was not put together for publicity purposes. The images are not like the stereographs that might have been put out by railroad companies. They are valuable for their imperfections and candidness. John Work Garrett's experience was not necessarily unique if you were an affluent American. Those with the means and adventure-seeking desire in the late 19th century embraced outdoor tourism. The desire began initially in the years after the Civil War, when veterans seeking to normalize their wartime experience began to go on camping trips. Civil War songs became the earliest campfire songs. Friends and family began to join them on these trips, and resulting guidebooks and publications promoting the joys of nature began to circulate. Of all of these writers producing publications, John Muir was one of the most influential. Beginning in the late 1860s, Muir dedicated his life to the preservation of the American natural world and wrote extensively about the impact of nature on a person's well-being, as well as the need for protecting land. John Work Garrett owned a first edition copy of Muir's Our National Parks that had been gifted to him by his brother Robert. Published in 1901, Our National Parks ultimately drew the attention of Theodore Roosevelt, who came to California to camp with Muir. Their camping trip has since become a legend in environmental history and is credited frequently with contributing to Roosevelt's conservation policies in his presidency. While Muir's influence enacted a lot of good in the federal government's preservation of land, he also had a history of making disparaging remarks about Black and Indigenous peoples, or just excluding them from the narrative of the land altogether. Writings like this reflected a general culture of racism and classism in this market. Outdoor tourism in the early 20th century largely catered to an affluent, white, American, or European audience who could afford the travel to parks and necessary guides. Individuals not in that group were denied the experience that Garrett had. Wealth was a significant need for these early outdoor tourists. At Yosemite, for instance, hotels cost around $3.50 a night, a horse about $2.50, and a guide $5 per day, totaling to $11 for those resources alone, or approximately $264 a day in 2024. One visitor to that park commented, quote, "Yosemite's not as bad as Niagara Falls, but money melts very fast," end quote. Just around the time that John Work Garrett was in Yellowstone, companies also began to produce specialty goods for camping and hiking. One woman visiting Yellowstone with her husband in the late 19th century listed a rental outfit that included, and this is just a sample of the full list, a wall tent, blankets, axe, hatchet, nails, ropes, hammer, and wheel grease, Flour, sugar, lard, eggs packed in oats, canned meats, fruits and jellies, a long-trailed frying pan, coffee pot, tin plates, cups and spoons, knives, and forks. For a quick reference, the total expense of this rental was $252 at a time when the United States gross national product per capita was $204. There was a profit to be made in this market, and companies that found their products adopted by campers began to cater towards those specific consumers. William Coffin Coleman, for example, initially designed lamps meant for merchants to use in their shops when they wanted to stay open later, and portable table lamps for use in rural homes. The strength of these lanterns made them naturally suitable for the outdoors and were adopted by that consumer market, looking for means of lighting their campsite outside of the campfire. By 1914, Coleman had designed his first lamp really intended for camping that came with modifications like a bug screen. Around the same time in Maine, Leon Leonwood Bean developed a shoe that combined leather uppers with rubber bottoms for individuals who needed to wade through wet terrain in the outdoors. Both of these products are still around today, albeit in more modernized forms. They're just two products in a 20th century world that was rapidly developing specialty objects meant to appeal to both a market of professional adventurers, but also the larger mass of buyers seeking the best tools for their recreational trip into the woods. I've talked a lot about men thus far, but women who could afford to were very much also in the world of outdoor adventure. Books and articles were published that specifically catered to a female audience, providing them with safety information as well as dress advice. Many women continued to wear dresses outdoors, usually made from light wool or alpaca that were about ankle length. In the early 20th century, tightly woven cotton became a popular material for clothing, which was warm and windproof, but susceptible to absorbing water. Some tools adopted by outdoorsmen and women were initially developed for laborers seeking better efficiency and comfort in their jobs. The Western saddle that John Work Garrett would have been expected to use on his Yellowstone trip was developed in the late 1860s as a fusion of the Mexican vaquero saddle and the English riding saddle, and was designed for cowboys who often spent full days on horseback following cattle herds. The deep seat allowed the rider to sit comfortably longer, and the pommel towards the front could hold rope or additional items. I like to use a Western saddle when horseback riding and can attest that their design has not significantly changed from this point in time. What was initially meant for a labor-intensive job serves a similar beneficial purpose for alternative uses like trail riding or rodeo sports. As a side, the Western saddle was actually a relatively new experience for Garrett, not just because of its design, but because it required him to ride astride a horse rather than side saddle. Garrett walked with a limp for most of his life after a childhood accident, and riding side saddle would have been a more comfortable riding experience for him. In his diary during the Yellowstone expedition, Garrett frequently mentioned a lot of discomfort relating to his saddle until he proudly wrote one day, quote, "I did not ride side saddle at all, but straddled all the way. Quite a new thing for me," end quote. Of perhaps more importance than what tourists brought with them is what they brought back from their time in the outdoors. At the time that Garrett set out for Yellowstone, nature, and the American West in particular, was only in the initial stages of being conceptualized as a place with limited resources that needed to be protected. Wealthy tourists would travel west to either play at running a ranch or on hunting expeditions. Whether as a trophy of a hunting trip, a souvenir bought from a shop, or, as in John Work Garrett's case, a specimen shot and stuffed for scientific study and display, taxidermy was an extremely popular way of bringing nature into the home. In the middle of the 1894 trip, Garrett writes after a visit to the stores, quote, "Our fur bill now amounts to $450. That's $16,000 in today's money. Surely we are a godsend to the taxidermist," end quote. For Garrett, taxidermy was a means of studying and identifying birds, as well as an opportunity for trophy hunting, and he was very engaged in the hobby as an adolescent. In the summer of 1887 alone, Garrett estimated shooting 30 to 40 birds that he either collected the skins of as specimens or taxidermized himself. The human relationship to animals has many, many layers of complexity to it. But in the context that we are talking about, several species on the plains were either viewed as plentiful enough that they could be commoditized as taxidermy or valued for their skins and furs, or they had become endangered enough that having an example of a specimen made it all the more valuable. Probably one of the more famous examples of this pathway to endangerment is the American bison. In the late 19th century, intense recreational hunting by European American tourists and the popularity of bison furs ultimately led to a decline in the bison population from an estimated 60 million in the late 18th century to just 541 animals in 1889. The species decline also meant a catastrophic loss of food and trade items for Plains tribes. Just before John Work Garrett's first trip, the federal government passed the 1894 Lacey Act, which prohibited the poaching of bison within the bounds of Yellowstone National Park and marked the first conservation effort on behalf of the bison by the United States. Those early efforts and more throughout the 20th century mean that today there are approximately 31,000 wild bison, making the endurance of the animal a common success story. However, their near extinction and revitalization has had enduring, unintended environmental challenges. Prior to its population decimation, bison grazing allowed native shortgrasses to dominate the plains. Today, however, bison graze within restricted boundaries, resulting in a proliferation of invasive species. As environmental historian Andrew C. Eisenberg sums up, quote, "Although preservationists probably saved the bison from extinction, they saved the species not as a functioning part of the plains environment, but as a functioning part of the American economy, a curiosity, a tourist attraction, target for hunters, and domesticated beast," end quote. We'll go into today's bison in a little more depth later, so stay tuned for that. For Garrett, while he was aware of the Lacey Act, and there are no records of him personally hunting bison during his trip, he still had a stuffed bison on display at Evergreen, as well as the bison pillow you saw on that last slide. Many of his diary entries during the trip record hunting elk, which the students occasionally may have needed to do as a source of fresh meat, but recorded with a sense that the creatures were an unlimited resource. The psychology of the environment as commodity is persistent in Garrett and his peers' records, just as Eisenberg argues that the bison's resurgence is today. I'm not making these points to depress any of you, but rather to highlight the psychology and material world of these early outdoor tourists have impacted both our perception and experience of the outdoors, as well as the literal environment itself. While all vacations and adventures must end, the memories and material evidence of an outing survive. People who visited national parks in the early 20th century collected souvenirs, much like we do today, that they then would display in their home. If you have been to Evergreen or intend to come visit us soon, you'll find John Work Garrett's collections in the den. 100-year-old eggs collected by him rest in a little box, while sketches completed by his brother of birds hang on the wall. This is an example of how early 20th century Americans brought the outside in. I mentioned that Garrett was an enthusiastic specimen collector and amateur taxidermist when he was young. Finished pieces, both purchased or created by him, were displayed in a space that he referred to as the museum, which was actually a room near the gymnasium that would later turn into Evergreen's Bosque Theater. Garrett and his peers were following in a collecting trend whose roots stretch further back than the Geological Expeditions generations. In fact, natural history collecting is as old as the United States, with early collectors like Charles Willson Peale seeking to acquire remarkable pieces of American natural history as a sort of contrast to the ancient ruins that decorated European countries. To early Americans trying to consciously assert the country's significance, Europeans had castles, and we had ancient wilderness filled with creatures that couldn't be imagined. A classic example of this is Peale's excavation of a mastodon skeleton in upstate New York for display in his museum. And that mastodon is still around, by the way, and on display in a museum in Germany if you ever want to see it for yourself. These early European American settlers also brought these collections into their homes as a means to impress. Monticello's entrance hall is ornamented with maps and natural specimens intended to highlight the vastness of America. You can also see a native skin hanging over the railings. The collecting of native art and artifacts and their display alongside natural specimens is a frequent theme in these European American displays, and one that really picks up steam in the years to come. In the last quarter of the 19th century, what was known as the Indian craze emerged among consumers as a sort of successor to what was called the Japan craze, which was a collecting frenzy for Japanese and Japanese-style products. Native goods were widely purchased both by tourists as well as by urban consumers who may have never traveled outside of their city, but could still procure a native good at a department store and bring it home to get across the same materiality of American nature that tourists in national parks were seeking. It is important to note here that the rising interest in native art coincides with the period of time in which native people had been largely forcibly relocated to reservations. No longer deemed a threat to European Americans, native tribes of the West in particular were quickly romanticized as figures of the past, despite being very much alive in the present. Their depictions were stoic, noble, and deeply connected to the natural world. Native goods, or goods intended to look native in style, would appear in residential spaces referred to as Indian corners. While some of these were more elaborate, like in this portrait, others may be as small as a shelf for a more modest collector. Indian corners were a sort of American-centric interpretation of the cozy corner trend of the late 19th century that was very much so a product of the exoticism movement. Cozy corners allowed the decorator to express their individuality and worldly interests through the acquisition and display of art, usually with a lot of textiles from non-European cultures in one space. Indian corners are particularly tied with the American arts and crafts movement, which sought a return to handmade decorative arts. Native art was seen as particularly therapeutic because of its close association to the natural world. In fact, native art made for the non-native market usually avoided any incorporation of details that might be perceived as modern or industrialized, even if it was a genuine part of the tribal group's culture or current artistic style, because it was not perceived as authentic to non-native consumers. Generally speaking, these spaces tended to follow a pattern with a consistent incorporation of specific materials. As I touched on before, cozy corners tended to include a fair amount of textiles, and the American interpretation of that favored a lot of native woven rugs or skins. There was also almost always some depiction of a native person looking stoic. The sitter would usually be positioned in a passive position in the photograph, print, or even calendar. Always romanticized, never threatening. While tourists like John Work Garrett, who visited reservations firsthand, are most frequently cited as being the primary consumers of native art for a non-native market, there was also a large amount of native goods sold in department stores. Historian Elizabeth Hutchinson, in her book, The Indian Craze, cites a writer who estimates that in 1901, $18,000 of native goods were being sold in New York. Regardless of where the consumer purchased the piece of art, European American collectors had a habit of describing native art in their home in terms of conquest. Their ownership of a particular item may have been a discovery, for instance. While the place of procurement of native art might have been less important to the general East Coast collector, the authenticity of the piece was significant. As we touched on before, products that were perceived as having been uninfluenced by technology were original. A great example of this unique perception of authenticity is a series of hide panels in the Evergreen collection. When John Work Garrett's father first purchased this set of panels made out of bison hide, they were cataloged as teepee liners. The panels now hang in the Evergreen den, but at some point they appear to have hung closer to an active fireplace as well, judging from the burns towards the bottom of many of the panels. The use of bison hide and the abstract designs meant that the attribution, possibly from the seller to John Work Garrett's father, went without a lot of questioning. The presumption was that these were used by a native group on the American plains, perhaps one of the ones John Work Garrett would later meet on his travels through the Yellowstone Valley. However, when looking closer, not everything is as it seems. First of all, these panels don't actually look like teepee liners at all. They're long, rectangular, and there is no sign of ties that you see in the piece on the center of this slide. Furthermore, while some of the designs can be directly tied to designs you would see on Lakota buffalo robes, others actually look more heraldic in nature. The tassels all over the panels are cut directly into the hide, which isn't consistent with Plains art. The cuts of these panels are asymmetrical and look almost intentionally handmade, which is inconsistent with the cleaner lines you might associate with a genuine liner. In fact, when we looked closer at these liners, we realized that they are much closer in manufacture to 19th century chaps than would have been worn by a cowboy. These brass snaps, for instance, are much more commonly seen on chaps than you would ever expect to see connecting two pieces of native art. These panels were never teepee liners, and we ultimately concluded that they were produced by a European-American craftsperson capturing their conception of a native style of design. The panels are, in reality, probably portieres, which are fabric curtains that were hung sometimes as doorways to divide spaces, like you see on the lower right photograph here. The manifestation of the American cozy corner in buildings made for the Western tourist market in particular would have benefited in their overall aesthetic from objects that looked handmade in a native style and composed of natural materials. You can see this in the Old Faithful Lodge, constructed in Yellowstone only a few years after Garrett's visit. It was built to attract affluent tourists with a comfortable place to stay within the park. The building was intentionally rustic in style, with native or native-style art incorporated in the furnishings to give a sense that the tourist was still having that outdoor adventure Garrett sought, just from a more comfortable lodging than a campsite. That search for a perfect balance between comfort and adventure is a thread that flows throughout the history of outdoor recreation and continues into the present. In general, many of the things we have discussed have had far-reaching impacts that affect how we experience certain components of the natural world today, sometimes in unexpected ways. The private collections of native art that we have talked about, for instance, became the foundational collections for several museums. While their interpretation has changed over the years as museums work to decolonize their collection and center the narratives of the object's makers, we still have to acknowledge that the original part of many of these collections was built around something assembled by a white collector for a European-American audience. Some of these objects, through the exchange of hands across cultures, may have lost their original purposes, histories, or tribal affiliations. Furthermore, the way many of these objects are arranged in exhibitions today favor European-American forms of storytelling or display. Historic displays show this most obviously. Looking at the arrangement in Monticello's entrance hall once again, we can see what is essentially a European salon wall style of arrangement. In recent years, museums have sought to address their collecting histories through decolonization, where they seek to free a collection from narratives influenced by a colonial past. In these examples of 3 museums in North America with relatively recent exhibitions or installations, they prioritize storytelling and curation based around the advisement of local indigenous groups. Collections built by early 20th century Americans seeking to highlight their understanding of cultures deeply connected to the American landscape impacted the material life of these artifacts well into the 21st century. While many museums are working to address this now, it is worth understanding how present-day staff is still strongly impacted by the legacy of historic collecting. Moving back to the outdoors, John Work Garrett's era of the national parks was often restricted to those who had the means to get there. Just a few decades later, accessibility to national parks increased with the advent of the automobile. 30 years after the Princeton Geological Expedition, Garrett wrote to a friend about a former classmate who had joined him in Yellowstone. Garrett wrote, quote, "Fred Peace was out west this summer in a Buick, trailing his family along, camping out and having a perfect and satisfactory, and indeed even a glorious time. He went over to the old farm only to find it terribly spruced up and more like a dude ranch than it was in our day," end quote. While the rugged adventure the Princeton students saw themselves as having in their youth maybe was a little more difficult to find, the automobile signaled greater opportunities for groups of people of all ages and abilities to access parkland. Still, the wealth and race restrictions that prevented equal accessibility to parks in Garrett's youth continued well into the 20th century. In 1922, so 3 years before Garrett wrote that letter about Fred Peace's Buick, the National Park Service superintendents declared, quote, "We cannot openly discriminate against Black visitors, but they should be told that the parks have no facilities for taking care of them," end quote. In accordance with state laws, both Shenandoah National Park and Great Smoky Mountains National Park were segregated until 1950. During that period of segregation, Black visitors were required to use inferior facilities that would lack easy access, significant viewpoints, or sufficient space. Despite the wider access to automobiles in the mid-20th century, wealth was also still a perceived prohibitor to park accessibility. Camping-specific consumer goods was a rapidly growing business, and by the mid-20th century, a proliferation of ads catering to the outdoor recreational family can be found in magazines and newspapers. The concept of what was needed for an outdoor adventure started to shift from things that one might be able to find in their home to objects that you needed to specially buy for your adventure. While some of these goods only increased comfort in your hike or camping experience, others critically increased safety. Though families may have no longer have needed the extent of products that Garrett and his peers once did, there was still a field of products only used in the outdoors that could be cost prohibitive. The age of the canvas-covered wagon, filled with heavy cast iron pans and 4 days straight of potatoes and bacon, had been replaced with a car toting an RV or loaded with lightweight tent supplies and portable cooking tools specially made for the outdoors. Coolers allowed a wider variety of food to be brought to the campsite, and beginning around the mid-20th century, we start to see more consistent recipes specifically associated with camping experiences. Hot dogs over the campfire replaced Garrett's dried meats, and I suspect the Princeton students and their love of desserts would have made them envious of the rise of the s'more in the early 1920s among Girl and Boy Scouts. Today, that consumer market has only increased, and relatively dramatically so. Around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people sought respite and safety in the natural world, the outdoor recreational market saw a massive increase in tools, outdoor apparel, which by this point has become its own fashion, and recreational equipment. To this point, I love highlighting this display on the bottom right of the screen, where kayaks are literally used as a piece of art in an outdoor store. It's the perfect fusion of a culture that has begun to embrace outdoor tools, not just as utility, but also as something that the consumer market is seeking an aesthetic value in as well. With the general change in environmental values among many American consumers, marketing for these outdoor specialty goods has evolved as well. And a move that really highlights the close ties between outdoor recreationist interests and specialty consumer products, companies that focus on outdoor retailing tend to focus on promoting reuse and longevity of the product. In a field where a faulty product has the potential to be fatal to a backpacker who is hours away from a road or hospital, objects need to be long-lasting and developed by companies that the consumers feel are trustworthy. One way this is established is by coinciding with customer values. The Don't Buy This Jacket campaign of 2011, for instance, was a promotion for environmental values, minimizing waste, that was directed at an audience of environmentalists. Speaking of the environment, let's circle back to the bison for one moment. That species, alongside many other animals that were identified as Keystone species, meaning an organism that can help define an entire ecosystem, have been reintroduced into Plains parklands over the past several decades, meeting with a range of success. Some of the same animals that Garrett hunted or purchased taxidermy of are now the same ones surrounding these reintroduction campaigns. It's interesting to note here, while we talk about history and the outdoors, one pin still remains from the original reintroduction of the wolf into Yellowstone in 1995, and there has actually been some discussion surrounding that pin, preserving it as a historic site. It really struck me while I was researching this talk how much of this history and legacy is still actively ongoing while becoming pieces of history in themselves. National park tourism's modern visitation would have been unrecognizable to John Work Garrett. When Garrett saw Old Faithful, he had ridden on ahead and was mostly alone, describing it as, quote, high and large, the water rising or being shot up is a fine, thick volcano with a front dial of stream, end quote. Later returning after supper to see the geyser by moonlight, saying, quote, it was great, better by some way, end quote. During which time he actually encountered one man from Sioux City, Iowa. Compare that with a photograph of that same geyser today. Perhaps due to great ease of access to get to locations that people have wanted to see all along, or maybe from an increased interest in nature after the pandemic, I think it's safe to say that the American public's enthusiasm for the national parks is probably here to stay. Unfortunately, this increased tourism has come with some downsides. Like in Garrett's Yellowstone, where the first gamekeeper of the park had only been hired 14 years prior to his visit, there is still a disparity between the number of park employees and annual visitors. Long wait times to get into parks has come with a new and somewhat unexpected consequence of decreasing accessibility. As a result, popular parks have started to institute time-ticketed entry to attempt to manage these truly never-before-seen attendance numbers. Meanwhile, parklands, like many parts of the world, are also seeing the impact of the perception of nature as an unlimited resource. In 2022, Yellowstone National Park was victim to a massive flash flood event that caused the evacuation of 10,000 park visitors and millions of dollars in repairs. While Yellowstone's roads may have been unfamiliar to Garrett today, the flash floods of this scale would have been as well. Standing in the center of this history is the principle of leave no trace. Created in response to a rising concern that the natural world was being loved to death, Leave No Trace had been organically developing as a method of education for recreational outdoors people in the 1970s, as a means to teach them low-impact ways to experience nature. It was officially adopted as something more formal and cohesive by 1989. By no means the first American educational campaign to protect nature, I think that honor goes to Smokey the Bear in 1944. The 7 principles, nevertheless, remain a significant means of education for anyone seeking to spend some time in nature. While it is important to minimize our traces on the natural world when we seek to go into it, we cannot ignore that we leave small traces behind when we share our experiences via photographs, collections, or storytelling among our friends, families, and colleagues. The social perception of the natural world is heavily impacted by the material culture surrounding it that can easily be accessed indoors, as well as narratives that people are exposed to through other experiences. In this way, the Princeton Geological Expedition and the remnants the students left behind to commemorate their trip is a great case study for examining just how their more candid experiences played a role in both capturing outdoor trends and impacting trends in the future. While things have definitely changed since John Work Garrett set off in his Western saddle, his too short horse, and his classmates to experience Yellowstone National Park for the first time, there are several things Garrett experienced that could just have easily fit into an account of a park trip today. One of my favorite quotes in Garrett's journal happens when he is looking around his campsite in a meadow near Yellowstone Lake. He wrote, quote, "I have never seen a prettier place. We are in a little aspen wood, a mile or so from the main creek, and 8 miles of river it empties into. To the north are high snow-covered mountains, rugged and broken. The valley is more than 10 miles long and very wide, as beautiful a place as one could find in 1,000 miles, end quote. That quote, to me, captures the experience of awe that can happen when you find yourself looking at an incredible view. And that, I think, will never stop being relatable. I hope you all enjoyed today's lunch with the libraries. If you're interested in learning more about John Work Garrett's travels to Yellowstone National Park, I highly encourage you to visit Evergreen Museum and Library in the coming months. The exhibit opens September 25th, 2024, and will be on view at Evergreen until June 8th, 2025. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you again for attending today's lunch with the libraries. I hope you enjoyed the presentation today, and now we have some time for me to answer any of your questions. I've seen a couple come in that I'll start with, but if you have anything else you want to ask, go ahead and drop it in the chat. So the first question I see is from Jack, who wants to know what artifacts are available to look at in Evergreen. And I love that question because I love talking about everything at Evergreen. I don't want to give too many spoilers about this upcoming exhibition, but you will be seeing those portieres on display. You will see the John Muir book, and we'll have art by some popular artists from the American West or who would depict the American West, like Remington and Proctor. In terms of the House Museum in general, it has pretty much anything you can imagine. We have art from French artists. We have a good collection of Asian decorative arts. We have Russian ballet designs, anything for the ballet russe. So I would encourage you to come check it out. It'll match any interest. Tulla asked, how did they preserve the eggs? Do they need special techniques to preserve them? So that's a good question. And it was one that I think haunted a lot of 19th century campers and 19th century people in general as they're living in a period where they may not have access to refrigeration if they're moving quickly from place to place like they are in camping. There were a couple of things they could have done. Egg pickling was an option. So they might have used quicklime, salt, and cream of tartar together to create this really thick pickle. They might also use water glassing, which is still a technique used by people like homesteaders today to preserve the eggs for a little bit longer. But the preferred solution was usually to make use of any town stops and pick up as many fresh things as they can between stops in town where they could get these resources. I also have a question from Cindy. What parallels do you see between Garrett's journey and nature travel today? Aside from visitor numbers and improved gear, do you think things are more similar than different? That's a really good question. I would say I'm going to start with the differences. And one of the major ones that I think we can't discredit is changes in gear and changes in understanding of safety and environment have affected how we experience nature. So if you take an outdoor sport like climbing, for instance, you can see climbers today are making sometimes more incredible achievements than we had seen in the past, sort of have higher goals. And a lot of that has to do with their gear helping them a little bit more than maybe previous gear or make-do gear was doing in the 1940s when they started climbing. However, with all of those changes to parks and the environment, there's still this very basic human psychology that hasn't changed. And I think it's the most critical part of our outdoor experience. And it was the case then that people go to the outdoors to experience a certain sense of awe and a certain sense of peace. There's been a lot of studies about the benefit of the natural experience, and that has not changed over time. And that sort of interest, that human interest in nature, is a very consistent thing across the timeline. Cindy also asked, did other members of the Garrett family also travel and explore nature, either predecessors or ancestors? So yes, and those travels are sort of what make up our eccentric Evergreen collection. John Work Garrett's father, T. Harrison Garrett, and his mother, Alice Whitridge Garrett, were both travelers. They would go around, they would collect things as well. John Work Garrett was probably, due to his diplomatic career, one of the most well-known travelers in the family. He held posts in South America and Europe as well, but the American West seemed to be his place of recreation. And his brothers also traveled with him. And that was something instilled in them very early. The three of them actually go on a trip out west and up through Canada that takes them several months when they're with a tutor. And they write home to their father a lot about the experience. And a lot of travel and travel impressions are kind of fostered by their parents at that time. Once T. Harrison dies, fairly tragically and unexpectedly in a yachting accident, John Work Garrett's mother actually really dedicates a lot of time to travel, and she brings her children with her. So they go through a huge trip through Europe. She moves up to Princeton with them while they're in college. There seems to be some avoidance of Evergreen in that period. So you see a lot of travel. And then, of course, John Work Garrett's wife, Alice, is probably the biggest traveler of them all. She really liked it. She's not as much, I would say she may not be as much the nature person. She really thrived in areas like Paris and New York, and you see a lot of that. And Garrett actually writes in some of his letters that she's much more out there than he is. He's a little more of a homebody. But she still does participate in these American West trips that she takes with her husband. She paints these beautiful landscapes, and there's some pretty incredible photos of her riding horses out west. So they all did a quite a bit of traveling. It was pretty expected for a family, I think, of that wealth status that the Garretts had to have the capability to travel, but it was also part of their education. So at the time of the late 19th century, there was the European Grand Tour that a lot of these individuals were expected to take. But then there was this rising interest in this American Grand Tour out west. So you see the big cultural things in Europe, and then you see this natural cultural thing happening in America. And you see some of these, usually men, but not always, affluent individuals experiencing both as part of their education. Allison has a question. I have a question related to archival research and materials. What type of records did you use to discover these details in addition to John Work Garrett's journal? That's a great question because it allows me to shout out the library's special collections here at Johns Hopkins. John Work Garrett was a bit of a pack rat and left a huge collection of wonderful papers. It's like Christmas for me to go through. And so apart from the journal that records in his own words, we also have a wealth of letters that he exchanged between other members of this expedition over the course of his life. So we get to see him go into business with some of these individuals. He has a cattle ranch in New Mexico at one point, which was something that was news to me going through the archival records. And he goes into business with a lot of his peers afterwards, and they talk a lot about this experience. Outside of that group of papers, which was definitely the basis of this exhibition, we also have a pretty good record out of Princeton of these expeditions in general, but also things like yearbooks and he was part of a student group called the Tiger Club at the time, and that has records as well that include some of these speeches where they have these reflections happening. And on top of that, you also have newspaper articles. When Garrett traveled out west, that was a compelling enough story that it does appear in some newspapers where they ask him when he gets back about his experience, and he will tell the reporter about it. And particularly in that one news incident in 1895, where the news had falsely said that they had been kidnapped, that generated a lot of press. And so there's a lot of interest in that particular expedition by newspapers at the time. So you see a lot more of a flurry of archival material from that period. And we have one more question from Joe asking, are there any events scheduled to view the exhibition? Yes, so we have a lot of exciting things coming up for Leave No Trace. It opens on September 25th. There will be an opening event associated with it where we will have some interesting speakers talking a little bit about things around the exhibition, like the history of natural collecting and how we collect today. There's going to be a outdoor market later this fall featuring a lot of artisan goods and workshops happening. And there's some other things I can't talk about quite yet in the winter and spring, but it's going to be a lot of fun, I can say, from behind the scenes. And I encourage you to keep track of those events with the Hopkins Museum's newsletter, which you can sign up for on our website at museums.jhu.edu. We also have a fall and a spring brochure of events that come out too. So keep an eye out for that. And those will give you all the pieces of information you need to know. It's very fun things coming up for this exhibit though. So I think that's all the questions we have at this point. If anything comes to mind afterwards, you are free to reach out to me over email. You can find me at museums.jhu.edu or library.jhu.edu in our staff directories. I encourage you to come visit us at Evergreen, whether for this exhibit or anything else down the road. There's lots of things to get excited about at this museum, and we'd love to have you. Thank you so much.